So if you recall yesterday, we had introduced Chapter 29, Appendix ISLM, right? So the Chapter 29 Appendix that we're referring to is this PDF document that was scanned and emailed to you because the current version of the text doesn't have this part of the appendix. So this document was emailed to you at some stage, I'm not sure when. If you can't find it or for some reason you don't have it anymore, then I did put it under my files on Sakai as well. Okay, so you can get it either on Sakai from my folder, otherwise in theory it's been emailed to you, you should have it. There are no slides for that section on Sakai, but there are some old slides from a previous version of the text which I will make available for you. So once I've finished with the ISLM section, I will upload these slides onto my folder on Sakai as well. Okay. Before we begin, is there any feedback or anything you want to sort out? Or any issues to raise? No? Okay. Then the content that we're going to be covering, and that we have covered some of, but we're just going to finish it off, was to derive the IS curve, derive the LM curve, put them together to get an IS-LM equilibrium. So we've done this part of our appendix. Then what we're going to do is use the ISLM model to analyze the effectiveness, in other words, what are the results or what are the outcomes or what happens when we engage in some sort of fiscal policy or monetary policy action. How do we use our model to understand the results or the effects of a fiscal or monetary policy action? And then finally, we will use this ISLM model to derive an aggregate demand curve. So briefly then, from yesterday, the IS curve we derived. We used this schedule of various of combinations of interest rate and real output from the expenditure side of the economy, in other words, using our aggregate expenditure model. We saw that as the interest rate goes down, so the level of autonomous expenditure goes up, and our equilibrium level of GDP goes up. In other words, as interest rate goes down, GDP goes up on the expenditure side of the economy. What does that look like as a relationship? If we have our first aggregate expenditure curve, we decrease the interest rate, our aggregate expenditure curve shifts upwards. We can plot those 2 points, interest rate versus equilibrium level of output. Once again, we increase the interest rate, aggregate expenditure shifts up once again, equilibrium level of output increases, and we have a third point, and we can join all those points together, and we call that the IS curve. It's called the IS curve because it represents all the points of equilibrium in the aggregate expenditure model. And any point of equilibrium in the aggregate expenditure model is characterized by equilibrium between investment and savings. That's what every point of equilibrium in the aggregate expenditure model represents. Therefore, the IS curve is all the different points where investment equals savings, hence we have the abbreviation IS. That's how we derive the term IS for the name of the IS curve. Oh, that was quick, damn. Okay. LM curve. We saw that if we look at the money market, as the interest rate increases, right, what would cause an interest rate to increase in the money market if we're assuming that the money supply is fixed? Okay, so we're looking at the demand side of the money market. Well, as output increases, as real output increases, right, so quantity of real money demanded, as real output increases, right, the interest rate will increase. Okay? So at a real GDP, as the interest rate falls, the quantity of money demanded increases. In other words, that is the negative relationship between interest rate and quantity of money demanded. However, at any given interest rate, as real GDP increases, the quantity of money, sorry, that's the inverse of it. At any given interest rate, as real GDP increases, the quantity of money demanded increases. Yes, that's fine. In other words, we're talking about now a shift in the entire money demand curve, right? So as real GDP increases, what we're doing is shifting the entire money demand curve, okay? So these two statements on the slide are talking about two different things. The one is about, as the interest rate changes, how does the quantity of money demanded change? The second statement is saying, well, as real GDP changes, what happens to the quantity of money demanded and the interest rates? In other words, what happens to equilibrium as real GDP increases? Sorry, did I mess up just now and say that the interest rate, as the interest rate goes down, GDP goes up? Is that what I said? Just double checking. No? Okay, good. So what does that look like as a relationship? As GDP goes up, right, as money demand shifts to the right, our interest rate, our equilibrium in our money market, our interest rate increases. So if we're plotting equilibrium real GDP against interest rate from the money market side of things, as real GDP increases, interest rates increase. We can continue plotting this relationship and then joining all our points. We have the LM curve. The LM curve is upward sloping. LM curve, L and M stands for liquidity. Liquidity equal to money. So money being money, in other words, money supply. Liquidity is money demand equals M, money supply. So LM, liquidity equal to money supply. So it's all the points of equilibrium in our money market as real GDP changes. So in other words, the relationship between GDP and interest rate in the money market. When we bring our IS and LM curves together, we have one point of equilibrium, point B. At that point of equilibrium, we know that we have both equilibrium in our goods market, aggregate expenditure equal to income, and equilibrium in our money market. In other words, money demand equal to money supply. At any other position, in other words, a position like A, D, C, or F, we saw that, for example, at point A, we may have equilibrium in our goods market, but we do not have equilibrium in our money market. What happens, therefore, is we're from a position of disequilibrium in our money market, adjustments occur. Those adjustments move us from point A towards point B. In other words, from point A towards equilibrium, those adjustments begin in the money market. Alternatively, we could be at a point like point F, where we have equilibrium in the money market, but we don't have equilibrium in our aggregate expenditure model. What happens, adjustments in our aggregate expenditure model, therefore, begin the process of moving us from point F towards point B. At point B, both markets are in equilibrium. We are happy. There are no more changes. We messed around with some diagrams of the money market and the aggregate expenditure model to see what happens if we are at a point like point A or F or C or D. In other words, if we're at a point of disequilibrium, how do we end up moving towards point B? Having put together our entire IS-LM model, what we now want to do is we want to use this framework to understand what happens when, either through a fiscal policy action or a monetary policy action, we shift either the IS curve or the LM curve, and we move to a new point of equilibrium. That new point of equilibrium will be characterized by different equilibrium real GDP and different equilibrium interest rates. Our interest is in understanding what happens to interest rates and what happens to real GDP when we embark on some sort of fiscal policy action or monetary policy action. So that's a brief recap of where we got to yesterday. We put our model together and we were going to start discussing more the shifts in the IS and LM curves. Does anyone have any questions or issues that they'd like to raise at this point? Anything that they would like me to reiterate or concentrate on? No? Okay. Then let's push on ahead. When we have an expansionary fiscal policy, our IS curve shifts to the right. We saw how to derive our IS curve. When our interest rate changes, so if we have aggregate expenditure curve AEA, when our interest rate changes, okay, so the key here is the interest rate. So if the interest rate decreases, the interest rate goes down, our aggregate expenditure shifts upwards. A decrease in interest rate increases, for example, investment spending. An increase in investment spending shifts the aggregate expenditure curve upwards. So a decrease in interest rate shifts our aggregate expenditure curve upwards, meaning at a lower interest rate, so if we initially were at interest rate 6 and we lower our interest rate from interest rate 6 down to interest rate 5, our equilibrium level of output moves from point A, 1,100 as our real GDP, so point A, 1,100. We move from point A towards point B. Point B, our equilibrium real GDP is 1,300. We plot point B at a lower interest rate and a higher level of output. That was the derivation of our IS curve. However, if our aggregate expenditure shifts upwards, not due to a change in interest rates, in other words, if we leave interest rates unchanged, but we increase autonomous spending, so for example, we increase the aggregate expenditure. So one way we could do that would be to increase government spending. If we increase government spending, we shift our aggregate expenditure curve upwards. Now we have a new equilibrium level of output at a higher level of output than we had previously. Which means for the same interest rate, we are no longer at point A over here with real GDP 1,100. We now have a higher equilibrium level of output, so we can plot our new point at interest rate 6, higher level of output. And if we continue this process, what we end up with is an IS curve that lies to the right of our original IS curve due to that increase in government spending. Question? What does expansionary monetary policy mean? Cool. Okay, I'll get to that. Do you know what expansionary fiscal policy is? Okay. So an expansionary policy means a policy essentially aimed at increasing output. That's the expansion. Okay? So an expansionary fiscal policy would be an increase in government spending or a decrease in taxes. Fiscal, correct. Increase in government spending, decrease in taxes. Those are expansionary fiscal. Okay. What we will see just now, when we shift the LM curve to the right, we have an increase in output, right? So what sort of monetary policy action would shift our LM curve to the right and lead to an increase in output, right? That would be an expansionary monetary policy. Okay, we'll talk more about how that happens. Let's just finish our discussion on IS for now. So is everyone happy that we can shift our IS curve to the right if we increase government spending? Happy? Happy? You guys happy? Has anyone got an issue with that? Yeah. If I decreased taxes, would I have the same effect? Remember, a decrease in taxes will mean that my autonomous expenditure shifts up for any given level of output. For any given income level, so in any given level of Y, if government reduces the taxes, I have more money to spend. Okay, so we're talking about lump sum taxes though. Okay, so we're not talking about a tax rate. Remember, change in the tax rate changes the slope of the aggregate expenditure curve. But a change in lump sum taxes, right, would mean that for any given level of income, a decrease in taxes means I have more money to spend. Okay? Yep.
You know how every expenditure is equal to consumption?
Yes.
So the change in consumption or investment will cause a movement along the iceberg. Is that what you mean? And not government, and not a shift.
Cool. So let me just write the equation out for you so we can. So we've got aggregate. So we've got aggregate expenditure is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Okay. Equal to Y at equilibrium. And in terms of my upward sloping aggregate expenditure curve, in other words, the relationship between Y and aggregate expenditure that is upward sloping, right? I'm writing Y equal to 1 over 1 minus B times A plus I plus G minus BT plus X minus M. So I'm just assuming there's no income tax rate and there's no marginal propensity to import. So all of these things are autonomous. Okay? So if I increase A, what would happen? So let me just remember, this entire term here is my intercept. Right? Okay, in other words, this value here is my intercept. Okay? Are you happy with that? Okay. So in other words, I'm using Y, but obviously what I'm plotting here is, let's not call it Y, let's call it aggregate expenditure, right? Okay. In other words, at some point of equilibrium when I've got Y, I'll have aggregate expenditure equal to Y equal to this, right? That's my intercept value. Okay. So if I increase A, I increase the intercept. If I increase I increase the intercept. If I increase G, I increase the intercept. If I decrease T, I increase the intercept. Increase X, intercept goes up. Decrease M, intercept goes up. What happens when my intercept goes up? I shift my aggregate expenditure curve up, right? What was your question?
Change in intercepts, like all those intercepts.
Yeah.
Investments, autonomous consumption, will they cause a shift in the IS curve or movement along the IS curve?
Cool. So if we're plotting our IS curve, plotting the relationship between I and output, okay? In other words, equilibrium in this model is determined by these different points of intersection of the 45-degree line, right? So this line is my 45-degree line. So here I have some interest rate, okay? Let's say that interest rate corresponds to, let's call this point A. So I've got interest rates at point A, and I've got some level of output, Y at point A. Okay? Now I tell you that government spending increases, not because of a change in interest rates, just government spending increases. I move from point A to, okay, let's call it point B, right? So now we've got a new equilibrium output here, YB. Okay? So my equilibrium output level here, let's plot it down, YB. Has my interest rate changed? when I've increased the government spending. I did not say that the government spending increased because of an interest rate change. I just said government spending increased, but I will make it clear, not because of an interest rate change, right? So for the same interest rate, I have a new equilibrium level of output. Okay? So if originally I had an IS curve that passed through this point, IA, YA, okay, I now can't have, once I've increased G, I can't be on the same IS curve, right? I have to be on an IS curve with a totally new relationship between interest rates and output, right? So because I changed G, not because of a change in interest rate, I've shifted my IS curve. What happens though if I increase I, so I goes up, but because I has decreased? Then what happens? Then I'm moving from, so my aggregate expenditure curve shifts upwards, let's say, because of a decrease in I. I've now moved from equilibrium point A with YA and IA to equilibrium point B, YB, right, with some lower interest rate, IB, right? So now I must be on the same IS curve, but I've moved along the IS curve. So I can have a change in any of these components. It could be a movement along an IS curve if the change in these components is because of a change in interest rate. So if A increases because of a change in interest rate, then it's a movement along. If G changes because of a change in interest rate, movement along. Cool. Righty-ho. So we can shift our IS curve or we can move along the IS curve. Now, the same applies to the LM curve. Let me just change the color here. Okay, there we go. I've got some level of money demanded for some level of output. Okay, and remember, my real money demand depends on my real level of output. So for this real level of output, this is the quantity of money I would demand at any given interest rate. Okay, my equilibrium is determined by where my money supply curve is. So given my money demand, MD0, and given my money supply, my equilibrium interest rate, given this level of output, will be 4%. So I can plot my point D. If, however, for the same level of output, in other words, with the same relationship between interest rates and money demand, if I were, as the Reserve Bank, to shift the money supply curve to the left, in other words, I were to reduce the money supply, okay? So from MS0 to MS1. For the same level of output, what has happened to my interest rate? The same level of output, right, MD0, what has happened to my interest rate? It has increased. So if I were to shift my money supply curve, are you happy that in fact the relationship between equilibrium interest rate and equilibrium and output, so output in my in terms of money demand, so my relationship between output and equilibrium interest rate, are you happy that it would change the relationship? When I shift my money supply curve to the left, what happens to the interest rate? It increases. So for the same level of output, there is a higher interest rate. You happy with that? Okay, and if we go one frame further, the same thing. If my money supply curve has been, my money supply curve has been shifted to the left, okay, so from MS0 to MS1, excuse me, my relationship here, my initial point D, my initial 1,100 money demand MD0, has an equilibrium interest rate here of approximately 5%. But for MD, it's not MD0, I thought it was MD0. It's actually MDD. Okay, MDE, what they're calling MDE, there's some level of output, 1,300. In other words, when output increases, when real output increases, my money demand shifts to the right. But whereas my equilibrium interest rate was at 5% point E with real GDP of 1,300, once my money supply has been shifted to the left, that interest rate has increased, right? So for MDE, my new equilibrium interest rate is 6%. So for 1,300, my new equilibrium interest rate is 6%. Are you happy now, therefore, if I join those points together and I go to my final LM slide? If I shift the money supply to the left, my LM curve shifts to the left. Is everyone happy with me, with the way I've done that? Raise your hand if you have a question or you have an issue. Or stare blankly forward. Okay. So if the Reserve Bank decreases the money supply, yeah.
Is that LM curve shifting because the money supply curve shifted or the other way?
Yeah, because the money supply shifted. Okay. So because the money supply shifted to the left, the LM curve has shifted to the left. Remember, we derive our LM curve from our money market. Okay? So changes in the money market affect the LM curve, not the other way around. Right? The LM curve simply reflects any changes in the money market. So we decrease the money supply, we shift LM to the right. How do we shift LM? Sorry, we shift LM to the left. How do we shift LM to the right? We increase, if the Reserve Bank, the central bank increases money supply. Okay? What are the tools for the Reserve Bank to increase money supply? How does the Reserve Bank increase money supply? Any options? Any takers? There's 3 different things it can do. Shout out anything. Yeah, what about the reserve ratio? Okay, so if they want to increase the money supply, what should they do to the reserve ratio? Okay, so they decrease the required reserve ratio. Yeah? Okay, what else can they do? Okay, they can change the repo rate. What should they do to the repo rate? Or what should they do to interest rates? To increase money supply. Okay, so decreasing interest rates would increase the money supply. There's just one issue here. If you assume that the Reserve Bank has control over interest rates, what you're assuming is that the money supply curve is perfectly horizontal. So what the Reserve Bank is doing is decreasing interest rates to shift the money supply curve down, right? When we shift the money supply curve to the right, we are automatically decreasing interest rates, right? Okay, so decreasing interest rates is essentially the same as actually shifting the money supply curve. Okay, if we have a perfectly vertical money supply curve, then the way that we decrease the interest rate is in fact increasing the money supply. Alternatively, if you assume that the money supply is horizontal so that the Reserve Bank has perfect control over the interest rate, then yes, the Reserve Bank decreases the interest rate, which then decreases equilibrium, quantity of money in the market. Okay, what's the third option? What's the other tool in the Reserve Bank's arsenal? Sorry, yeah? Sorry? Printing money. Okay, yeah, so that would kind of be, let's just see if I can make this somehow clear. So when we say printing money, like you're suggesting, just printing money, right? That would be shifting it to the right. So if we've got a vertical money supply curve, then printing money is the same as decreasing the repo rate. Okay? You get what I'm saying? In other words, if we got a vertical money supply, we would say we print money, and that shifts it to the right, right? If we had a horizontal money supply, we would say we decrease the repo rate, which is the same as saying printing money, in a sense. You get it? It's just depending on which kind of model we're using, we use different terminology Okay? So yes, printing money, which is kind of the same as decreasing the repo rate. But there's one other thing that we can do. Yeah? Okay, open market operations, we can go into the market. Should we buy bonds or sell bonds? We should sell bonds. So let's go, so open market operations, OMOs, and we're going to sell. Okay. Everyone happy with that? So shifting the LM curve to the right, that's the kind of monetary policy action we're going to undertake. Yeah. Oh, you're absolutely right. Sorry, my bad. Buy bonds. Good call. Okay? Question? No? Yeah, it's buying bonds, yeah?
From the government.
The Reserve Bank, when it does open market operations, is through the marketplace. So it doesn't buy them directly from the government. And I get where you're getting confused there. And it's a good thing not to be confused about. Yeah, an open market operation means not from the government. It means from the marketplace. Okay, so when it buys bonds in the marketplace, it means people are already holding bonds, okay, in the marketplace. It's not new bonds that government's issuing. It's bonds already held in the marketplace by banks, by individuals, by anyone that's in the market. Okay, the government's not going to hold its own bonds. The government issues bonds, right? So when we're talking about in the marketplace, it's not government holding bonds in the marketplace. It's someone else holding the bonds in the marketplace, right? Okay, so people in the marketplace have bonds, right? So we're talking about like banks, for example, or you and I. Okay? Let's say you are holding the bond and I'm the Reserve Bank. Okay? I come to you and I say, I would like to buy your bond. Okay? What that does is it bids the price of the bond up. Okay? When it bids the price of the bond up, it means the yield on the bond, in other words, the interest rate on the bond goes down. When the interest rate on the bond goes down, it means the opportunity cost of actually holding money goes down. And remember, at any given interest rate, as interest rates go down, we're happier to hold money, right? So me entering into the bond market and purchasing bonds, driving the price of bonds up, lowers the interest rate. In lowering the interest rate, lowers the opportunity cost of money and makes people happier to hold money, right? Now, when I buy the bond from you, I take the bond from you, and what do I give you in return? I give you money, exactly. And you're happier to hold that money because the return on money has gone down. Okay? Not the return on money, sorry, the opportunity cost of money. Interest rate has gone down. The price of money has gone down. So you're happy to hold that money. So I've given you money and I've taken bonds. I've increased the money supply in the market. In other words, I had money printed. I think the Reserve Bank calls it stationary, right? So it's just printed in the Reserve Bank. It's not in circulation. It's not part of the economy, right? What I do after I've printed that money and I want to buy the bond from you is I take that printed money out of my vault, I give it to you, I take the bond, and now I hold the bond and you hold money which you can spend in the economy.
We're creating money for me.
I haven't created money for you, I've given money to you. I have created money to buy the bond from you. Right? Okay. So in purchasing the bond from you, I have increased the money supply. I've increased the amount of money in circulation in the economy. Okay. So yeah, buying bonds shifts LM curve to the right. Okay. So if we then get to our monetary policy slide, if I shift the LM curve to the right, I see that my equilibrium occurs at a higher level of output, right? And of course, we've got a lower interest rate. So any monetary policy action that lowers the interest rate, that shifts the LM curve to the right and increases the level, the equilibrium level of output in the ISLM model would be an expansionary monetary policy. Okay? So an increase in the quantity of money shifts the LM curve to the right, interest rates fall, real GDP increases. Real GDP increases because the lower interest rate brings an increase in interest-sensitive expenditure. In other words, when we shift the LM curve, right, here's our new point of equilibrium. Okay? Relative to our old point of equilibrium, where we were on an IS curve, right, we need to move along our IS curve to get to our new point of equilibrium. How do we move along that IS curve? By changing the interest rate. The decrease in the interest rate causes a movement along the IS curve. Investment spending increases, or any other interest-sensitive spending increases. So this would be an expansionary monetary policy. Okay? Anything that, in other words, increasing money supply, expansionary monetary policy. It lowers the interest rate as well. Okay? So in other words, an increase in money supply, in other words, a decrease in the interest rate is expansionary monetary policy. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah. How far to this? Yeah. Yes. Excuse me, the Reserve Bank? The government doesn't own the Reserve Bank, no, but it's part of government. It wouldn't really make a difference whether it was nationalized or not. It's largely irrelevant who owns it.
But would there be difference in those scenarios?
No. Remember, the Reserve Bank doesn't operate in terms of a shareholder mandate, right? It doesn't operate in terms of a mandate, like whether it was privately owned or nationally owned, right? It's irrelevant because it doesn't matter who owns it. The Reserve Bank doesn't exist to serve the ownership. The Reserve Bank has its own mandates in terms of the Constitution. The Constitution tells the Reserve Bank control, or at this point, its primary objective is control inflation. So the Reserve Bank does whatever it needs to do to try and control inflation. Now, in the model so far, we've just assumed that prices are constant. Okay? So we're not worrying about inflation here. But the Reserve Bank has a secondary mandate, which says if inflation is under control, right, do what you can to improve growth. Right. So we can see that if inflation is under control, in other words, we're not worried about prices changing because our prices are in fact fixed. If the Reserve Bank lowers the interest rate, that's good for growth. You happy with that? So if inflation is under control, what should the Reserve Bank be doing? Promoting growth. Doesn't matter who owns the thing. Private owners, government owners, it's irrelevant. The Reserve Bank does not operate in terms of a mandate given to it by a shareholding or by any kind of ownership structure. It operates in terms of a mandate given to it by the Constitution. So it doesn't matter at all. Who cares who owns it? You can own it, and sometimes, in fact, the ownership of the Reserve Bank is the following. You get a fixed dividend per share. So in the same way that the government bonds pay you a fixed interest rate, if you buy a government bond, you will earn a fixed interest rate on that government bond, right? If you buy a share in the Reserve Bank, the same thing. You just earn a fixed dividend. So whether the government is running a deficit or the government is running a surplus, it doesn't matter what the government does. If you buy a bond from the government, you just get a fixed interest rate, right? Same thing with the Reserve Bank. If you own a share in the Reserve Bank, irrelevant what the Reserve Bank does, you just earn a fixed dividend. And it's, I don't know, it's some, I don't know exactly what the number is, but I think 10 cents. And I don't know what the price of those things are, but 12 Rand 50, which means you then have a fixed, essentially, if you buy it at 12 Rand 50 and you're earning 10%, you just earn a fixed dividend of 10%. I mean, of 7%, given that pricing, which is about what you earn on a government bond as well. So once you own a government bond, obviously the price of a government bond can change, right? in the same way that the share in the Reserve Bank can change. But whatever the change in interest rates is on government bonds will be reflected in the change in what the return would be on the Reserve Bank, just because it's another part of government. And it doesn't matter, it's not there to make profit, so whether it makes a profit or it makes a loss is irrelevant. You just earn a fixed return, the same as a government bond. So ownership is, I mean, I know that there's been talk in political discourse about who owns the Reserve Bank. It's meaningless, it means nothing. What matters is who determines the mandate of the Reserve Bank. And if the mandate of the Reserve Bank is determined by the Constitution, then the Reserve Bank is a brake on reckless government spending. In other words, the Reserve Bank can counter reckless government spending. So if the executive is making decisions that are going to endanger the economy, the Reserve Bank has an entirely separate mandate from the Constitution, not from the executive, to act in a way that would counter what the executive is doing, right? So the only real problem, the only debate that should be around the Reserve Bank, and which it's not, is does the executive control the Reserve Bank, right? And if the executive controls the Reserve Bank, and the Reserve Bank then acts not in accordance with its mandate in terms of the Constitution, then you would say something like the Reserve Bank's been captured. And it is no longer something that is operated by the people. It's no longer accountable to the people because it now no longer fulfills its mandate in terms of the Constitution. It's now fulfilling some other mandate from somewhere else, to use the words of the General Secretary of the ruling party. Okay, so LMIS, we can shift these things. So we know, just going back to this slide, if we shift the money supply curve to the left, in fact, let's do this as an it's a break time. Okay, so we'll take a break now, and then I will, just to finish this chapter, I will get you to do an exercise, which will move us on to the next chapter, chapter 28, the ASAD model. So we'll begin that after the break, after doing an exercise on this. Questions, come down. Otherwise, 10 minutes and we'll start again.